In medieval England, a countess rode naked through Coventry to spare her people attacks. She was real. Her name sits in the Domesday survey with her lands and her town. The ride doesn't. It was first written down by a monk in another county nearly 2 centuries after she died. Today, 10 medieval legends historians still can't explain. Where did each one really come from? Let's go. Number 10. Lady Godiva's Naked Ride. A monk bent over a desk at Saint Albans Abbey, dipped his pen, and wrote a story under the year 1057. He was writing 2 centuries after that year had passed, far from the town his story described. His name was Roger of Wendover, and the lines he set down in Latin are the oldest surviving account of the naked ride of Lady Godiva. His version doesn't match the picture the world carries. In it, Godiva rides through Coventry with her hair loosed and falling around her like a covering, and she doesn't ride alone. 2 knights ride beside her. Nobody in the town sees her, the chronicler writes, except for her very white legs. There's no order to shut the windows, and nobody covers their eyes. A later copyist at the same abbey struck one detail out of the passage, the 2 knights, and with that single deletion, an escorted procession became a lone naked woman on an empty street. That is the image everyone inherited. The woman underneath all of it was real and thoroughly documented, just not for anything she took off. Her English name was Godiva. She was the wife of Leofric, Earl of Mercia, one of the strongest men in England under Edward the Confessor, and around 1043 the 2 of them founded a Benedictine house at Coventry, an abbot and 24 monks. When the Normans finished counting England in 1086, her name was still in the survey. Godiva held Coventry in 1066, 5 hides there, 9 more at Anstey and Foleshill. She was the one great woman landholder left standing after the conquest. The chroniclers of the century after her death do write about her. They write about gold. The church she paid for was loaded with gold and silver until the walls seemed too narrow to hold it, and dying, she gave orders that her necklace of gems be hung around the neck of a statue of the Virgin. Not one of them mentions a horse. Then there's the seam. Chroniclers of the 14th century, retelling the ride, all attach the same small qualification to the reward. Coventry was freed from every toll, they write, except the toll on horses. That's a strange thing to invent. A miracle doesn't usually end with a tax left standing, and it wasn't invented. A royal inquiry under Edward I found exactly that arrangement on the ground, and in 1355 the prior of Coventry, handing over the Friday market, kept back for himself the right to take toll for horses. The exemption was real, and it sat in the account books. The legend fits it the way a key fits a lock, which is what happens when the lock is cut first. The story looks assembled backwards, built to explain a tax oddity that was already there. The ending has the same problem running the other way. Leofric, moved by what his wife has done, frees the town and confirms it with a charter. No such charter has ever been found, and the county history of Warwickshire states flatly that there's no historical evidence of any charter granted to Coventry by Leofric. The liberties the town actually received, a mayor, bailiffs, a common seal, came by charter from Edward III in 1345, close to 3 centuries after the ride was supposed to have bought them. The scene doesn't fit the place either. It needs a town with a market square and citizens holding rights. Coventry in the middle of the 11th century had 69 households, 7 of them slaves, perhaps 350 people working the land. There was no crowd to look away and no market square to ride across. And the plot has the wrong 2 people in it. Hilda Ellis Davidson, writing in the journal Folklore in 1969, pointed out that the tolls of Coventry were under Godiva's own authority. Her husband collected the royal war tax. Begging him to lift charges that were hers to lift isn't a sacrifice, it's a paperwork error. Here the source is split. One reading keeps something real underneath, a penitential procession. A woman walking through her own town stripped not of clothing, but of the marks of her rank, since the Latin word nuda can mean bare of ornament as easily as bare of skin. Against it stands the wording itself. In the language of the earliest tellings, naked meant naked. Daniel Donahue, the Harvard professor who wrote the literary history of the legend, is blunt about where knowledge stops. The chroniclers of Saint Albans, he says, inserted a fully developed narrative into their Latin histories 2 centuries after she died, and it works as an origin myth for the town. Nobody knows quite why the legend was invented and attached to her name. That's the honest state of the question, from the man who spent a whole book on it. What came afterward can be dated to the year, and none of it is medieval. The order to stay indoors and shut the windows first appears in 1569, in a chronicle by the printer Richard Grafton, who later sat in Parliament for Coventry. A wooden figure stood on Greyfriars Lane by 1678, cut from a single piece of oak, wearing armor of about the year 1500, most likely a St. George handed a new job. On the 11th of June, 1773, the city annals of Coventry name him for the first time, and they do it in the accounts, recording that the corporation had paid for a fresh wig and paint. Peeping Tom entered the story as a municipal expense. Whatever else stays uncertain, Godiva herself doesn't. She held land, she founded a house of monks, and her name sits in the tax survey of England in a clerk's hand. The legend grew around a woman who was actually there. The next one grew around far less. One line in the Irish annals, a single sentence about something seen overhead, and 500 years of retelling that turned it into an anchor caught fast in the stonework of a church arch. Number 9. The ship that sailed the sky. 8 Latin words on a page of Irish annals. Navis in aere vises sunt cum viris suis. Ships were seen in the air with their own men. That is the entire record. No lights, no glowing disk, no description of a single face. One sentence and blank parchment around it. The scribe of the annals of Tigernach said it last among the entries for his year, 748. Earlier in the same year, he wrote of snow so monstrous that the cattle of Ireland mostly died, and then of a great and unaccustomed drought. 4 separate collections carry the line, and each dates it differently. 743 in the Four Masters, 744 in the Annals of Clonmacnoise, 748 in Tigernach, 749 in Ulster. Only the Ulster scribe names a place, above Clúin Macu Noise, the monastery of Clonmacnoise on the Shannon. Tigernach names nowhere at all. That sky was already crowded. 2 years earlier, the Annals of Clonmacnoise report that dragons were seen in the skies. And in the Ulster year of the floating ships, a few lines up the same column, the community of Iona drowned. Real monks in real water, 1 entry away from a man drowning in air. Then the sentence starts to grow. The Book of Leinster moves the wonder to the great assembly at Teltown in Meath, under Domhnall son of Murachad, and makes it 3 ships. Bishop Patrick of Dublin, Gilpatrick, dead in 1084, had already turned it into Latin verse, and by then there is a crewman aboard, though still no king and nobody on the ground. The Book of Ballymote gives the scene its full cast. 1 ship over the fair, King Cungalick below, and a sailor who throws a fishing dart at a salmon. The dart drops among the crowd. He climbs down after it. A man on the ground seizes the shaft, and the visitor shouts that he is drowning. A later Irish text keeps the man and swaps his weapon. The dart becomes an anchor, and the fairground becomes the church of Clonmacnoise. Around 1250, a Norwegian book of instruction for princes, the Konungsskuggsja, the King's Mirror, delivers the finished drama. Sunday Mass. An anchor comes down on a rope, and the fluke of it catches fast in the stone arch above the church door. The whole congregation walks out into the daylight in the middle of the service and stares up the line. A man climbs down it, and his arms and legs move exactly like those of a man swimming in the sea. The people take hold of him. The bishop forbids it and orders him released, because holding him will kill him. The anchor stayed in that church afterwards, kept as witness. Gervase of Tilbury, writing about 1211 for the Emperor Otto IV, sets the same anchor somewhere in Britain and lets it end badly. The parishioners keep their grip, and the man suffocates in the moisture of our thicker air like a sailor lost in a wreck. The crew above waits an hour, cuts the cable and sails on. The anchor is beaten into ironwork for the church door, and Gervase reports that it can still be seen there. A French abbot, Geoffroy du Broy, had already dropped the same anchor on London in 1122. The assembly of a legend is visible here line by line, and Gervase isn't collecting curiosities. He files the anchor beside a second story as two proofs of one idea. A merchant sailing from Bristol to Ireland drops his knife overboard, and the knife falls through the skylight of his own house in Bristol onto the table in front of his wife. Above the world, in this cosmology, lie the waters divided by the firmament in the first book of Genesis. An anchor snagged on a church arch is no miracle at all. It is a routine navigational accident, watched from the seabed. Here the scholars split. John Carey traces a literary migration. The snagged anchor existed separately, in a gloss to an early Irish hymn, where an ordinary ship's anchor catches on a monastery lying under the sea, and the monks of Clonmacnoise, he argues, took that anecdote and welded it to their own marvel. Carey's own verdict is blunt. The nature of these supposed ships can no longer be demonstrated. Princess Mac Cana reads it instead as folklore doing its usual work on the border of two worlds, where one man's sea is another man's dry land. The natural explanations are strong and specific. A ship-shaped cloud, the northern lights, an upper mirage lifting distant hulls above the horizon. Documented doubles exist. In 1798, hundreds of people watched impossible vessels over the coast near Croagh Patrick, and it was a naval squadron chasing the French. In 1796, an observer on the Bay of Fundy counted 15 craft and concluded on his own that cloud at sunrise had made the shapes. Those readings close the one sentence in the annals. They don't touch the anchor, the swimmer, or the question of why the same scene keeps surfacing in traditions with no link between them. From an archbishop of Lyon complaining in 815 about a land called Moagonia, whose cloud ships steal grain, down to a Texas newspaper in 1897, describing a cable dragging over the rails, and an anchor left in the local blacksmith's shop. The swimmer got out alive for one reason. A bishop raised his hand and ordered the crowd to let him go, and the rope carried him back up into his own sea. The next man had no exit at all. He wasn't allowed to leave, and he wasn't allowed to die, and for 400 years clerks across Europe kept writing down the dates on which he had been seen. Number 8. The man who cannot die. An archbishop out of Greater Armenia came off the road in 1228 with letters from the Pope and a knight of his retinue to speak for him. He sat at the table of an English abbey and ate with the brothers while the knight turned his words into French. When the food was cleared, the monks put a question to him. They'd heard of a man who was present when the Lord suffered, spoke with him, and was living still. The archbishop answered that he had eaten at the same table with that man. The name he gave was Cartaphilus. The Latin calls him Ostiarius, a doorkeeper, the servant on duty at the gate of the hall of Pontius Pilate. As the condemned man was hauled out through that doorway, the doorkeeper punched him in the back and jeered at him to move faster, asking why he lingered. The reply was flat and literal. The Lord would go, and this man would wait until he came back. No thunder in it, no demon. A servant demanded haste and was handed haste without end. He doesn't simply stop aging. He runs on a loop. Every 100 years he drops into something like a fainting fit and wakes a man of 30, the age he was on the morning of the Passion, and he can't die until the Lord returns. And in this earliest telling he isn't a villain. He's baptized, the Chronicle says, by Ananias, the man who baptized the Apostle Paul, and lives as a hermit, speaking only when spoken to, refusing every gift the curious bring. waiting for the second coming with dread. What unsettles scholars is the form. It isn't a parable, it's reportage. A place, a year, a named house of monks. Matthew Paris, a monk and artist of the same house, copied it into his Chronica Majora and stiffened it, naming 2 men who vouched for it. Richard of Argentomium, a knight who had gone as a pilgrim to Armenia, and Gwaleran, bishop of Beirut. In 1243 the same archbishop was telling it again at Tournai, in the Low Countries, and a second chronicler wrote it down. The cross-checking is real, and it rests on one anonymous link. Nobody recorded the name of the archbishop. Between the words of the doorkeeper and the ink on the parchment stood an Eastern bishop with no name, a knight translating out of one tongue into another, and a monk writing it in a third. And the famous English entry isn't the first. 5 years earlier, in 1223, a Cistercian chronicle in southern Italy logged travelers from beyond the mountains who told the abbot they had seen in Armenia a man who was there at the Passion, shoved the Lord, and was told he would be waiting. He has no name in that entry. He already has the whole machinery. From old age back to 30, every 100 years, unable to die until the Lord comes. Then there's the picture. Matthew Paris drew the scene himself in the margin, a stooped figure with a hoe and a speech scroll facing Christ under the cross, and the hoe is the tool medieval art hands to coin. That drawing contradicts the text on the same page twice. In the text the blow lands in the doorway of Pilate's hall. In the drawing it happens out on the road to Golgotha. In the text the doorkeeper tells Jesus to hurry. On the scroll he tells him to go on to the judgment prepared for him. The man who wrote the words illustrated a different version of them. Here the sources split. One camp reads the whole thing as European bookmaking assembled from Scripture. The line at the end of the Gospel of John saying a disciple would remain until Christ returned, which the Gospel itself then moves to deny, plus the servant Malchus and the officer who struck Jesus in the face. No canonical text contains the legend. The other camp notes that every early source puts the man in Armenia, which smells of an Eastern tale carried west by pilgrims. But the monks weren't told the news, they asked for it, and by later summaries they were asking about a different immortal. Their question shows the tale already circulated in England before the guest opened his mouth. He supplied confirmation, not the source. One argument gets repeated and shouldn't be. It says the legend vanishes for about 370 years between these chronicles and a German pamphlet of 1602. It doesn't vanish. In Italy, he runs on unbroken under the name Budadeus, the one who struck God. A lawyer of the Kingdom of Jerusalem uses it as a byword for long life before 1270. An astrologer of Forlì records meeting him in 1267, walking through the town toward Compostela. A Florentine manuscript has him in 1411 pulling a child out of a snowstorm, never staying more than 3 days in one town, and saying nothing when asked point blank if he was that man. The pamphlet of 1602 runs 4 leaves, and its title page fails every check. The printer and the town named on it can't be traced, and the author signs with a pseudonym. Its only witness, a Lutheran theologian who supposedly saw a tall barefoot man in rags bowing at the name of Jesus in a Hamburg church in the 1540s, had been dead 4 years when it appeared. That booklet is where the wanderer first becomes a shoemaker and gets the name Ahasverus. 8 editions came out in that 1 year, and sightings were logged city after city into the 1640s. Who wrote it is still unsettled. Dozens of people swore they had shared a road, a church, or a meal with this man, and not one of those encounters leaves behind anything an investigator could handle. The next case runs the other way around. There's one witness, alone on a road at night, and the chronicler who took his statement doesn't ask for trust. He produces a physical mark and insists he examined it with his own eyes. Number 7. Helicon's Army of the Dead. The road out of Bonneval lay empty under an 8-day-old moon, and the priest on it was not afraid of the dark. Wauquelin served the church of Saint Albans in the diocese of Lisieux, and on the first night of January in 1091, he was coming back alone from a sick man at the far edge of his parish. What he heard first was not a voice. It was the tramp of a host on the march, harness and feet and grinding baggage. He assumed it was Robert of Bellem moving men toward the siege of Courcy. By the calendar, he was almost right. That siege was running in those very days. Then the column came into view, and it did not end. First the ones on foot, with bundles and sheep and furniture on their shoulders, like an army going home with plunder. A giant with a club stepped into the field and blocked the way to the 4 medlar trees where the priest meant to hide. The giant did nothing. He waited for the column to pass. A guard, not a killer. Behind them came dozens of litters, and on each one sat something dwarf-sized with a head like a barrel. Then women riding side-saddle on saddles studded with red-hot nails, thrown a cubit into the air by the wind and dropped back onto the points. Then churchmen in black copes and black knights under black banners, their armor burning like fire. One of the dead called to him by name. Landry of Orbec, viscount and lawyer, killed that same year, begged him to carry word to his widow. The dead in front and the dead behind shouted him down. "Don't believe Landry," they said. "The man is a liar." And among the horses and litters the priest recognized animals belonging to people who were still alive. Then he did the thing that makes the account strange. He decided nobody would believe him without something he could hold in his hands and stepped out to steal a horse. The first riderless black tore free. The second stood still and breathed out a cloud of steam the size of a grown oak. The stirrup under his foot was glowing iron. The bridle in his hand was unbearably cold, a cold that went through to his insides. Fire and frost in one grab. 4 knights broke from the column, and one of them took him by the throat, with a hand that burned like fire. Here is the turn. Orderic Vitalis, monk of St. Evroul, did not write this as a parable. He wrote it as a deposition. He set down the exact date, the phase of the moon and the constellation it stood in, so the light on the road could be accounted for. He recorded that the priest was forbidden to speak for 3 days, lay ill for a week, then rode to Lisieux and reported to Bishop Gilbert Maminot, once personal physician to the conqueror. He wrote it in the 1130s, some 40 years after that night, and for about 15 of those years he knew Wauquelin himself. And he produced physical evidence, a burn left on the priest by a dead man's grip, which the chronicler says plainly that he saw with his own eyes. The punishments are built out of the instruments of the sins. William of Glose, steward and moneylender, rides with a bar of red-hot iron in his mouth, taken from the very mill he seized from a poor man over a debt, and he says it weighs more than the Tower of Rouen. The priest's own brother carries on his heels a clot like caked blood, and explains that it is not blood but fire, punishment for the spurs with which he drove his horse to spill blood. Then comes an accounting of masses. Their father Ralph was freed by the first requiem his son ever sang, and the brother expects to lose his sword a year after Palm Sunday. Orderic even puts his own abbot into that column, beside men whom human judgment already counted among the saints. Here scholars split, and have for nearly 2 centuries. Jacob Grimm gathered all of it into one thing, the Wild Hunt, a night ride of the dead behind a pagan god. Ronald Hutton answered that Grimm welded together traditions never joined before, and that the unified Wild Hunt is a 19th century construction. Jean-Claude Schmidt reads the same night as church instruction, a sort of itinerant purgatory. Pain measured against sin, sentences shortened by masses and alms, and a practical aim behind it, bringing armed knights under clerical discipline. Jacques Le Goff dated purgatorium, the noun for purgatory as a place, to the 1170s, which leaves Wauquelin describing the machinery 40 years before theology gave it a name. Newer work finds ideas of cleansing after death already circulating before that, So the neat schedule looks too neat, and the point is contested rather than settled. The account contains none of the picture most people carry. No hounds, no horns, no stag, no hunting god at the head of it. This is a march with baggage. Helican never appears as a character. There is only Familia Herlicini, the household of Herlican, a name the frightened priest repeats to himself. The huntsman Hennekin who sold his soul is village folklore, written down 7.5 centuries later. Nor did Orderic invent any of it. Walkelin says he had heard such tales before, and had laughed at them. The name outlived every witness. Soldiers of Herluin, thrown as an insult at the courtiers of the king's household in the 1170s. A king named Helican sending a messenger onto a stage at Eris in 1276. A devil called Alicino in Dante. And at last Harlequin in his patchwork. Orderic at least had something to put on the table. A scar on a living man he could question for 15 years. The next case is built the other way round. The evidence is enormous. It can be seen from across a valley, it is cut into the chalk of a hillside, and for all the centuries when somebody should have described it, not one writer set down a line. Number 6. The giant nobody recorded. On a steep green shoulder of chalk downland in Dorset, above the village of Saint Albans, a naked man is cut into the hillside. He stands 180 feet tall. His right arm is raised, and in that hand he grips a knotted club 120 feet long. He isn't painted or built. He's a trench, roughly 2 feet deep, dug through the turf into the white chalk underneath, and that trench is the only thing keeping him alive. Chalk weathers. Grass creeps back over the edges. Every so often the whole outline has to be beaten in again with fresh chalk hauled up the slope in buckets and hammered down with wooden rammers. The most recent rechalking took 17 tons of wet Dorset chalk and about 2 weeks of handwork, which means the giant standing on that hill today isn't old at all. He's the newest repair of something much older, held in place by human labor, one generation handing the buckets to the next. Yep. In 2019, a team from the National Trust, the University of Gloucestershire, and an environmental archaeology unit set out to find what lay underneath. In March 2020, they cut into the giant's right elbow and his right foot and dug down about 3 feet into the silt that had slowly filled the original outline. Professor Philip Toms tested those samples with a laboratory method that doesn't measure the chalk at all. It measures light. It works out when the grains of sand inside a deposit last saw the sun. 5 samples went in. 1 failed outright, 2 little quarts in the upper muddy chalk to give a reading. The other 4 came back with dates, and in May 2021 they demolished 2 centuries of confident belief. Not prehistoric, not Roman. The deepest sample, taken from the fill of the very first cut, placed the figure between roughly 700 and 1100, with a midpoint in the early 10th century, which drops the giant into the middle of the monks. In 987, a West Saxon magnate remembered as Athelmer the Stout founded a Benedictine abbey directly at the foot of that hill and moved the bones of a local hermit Saint Eadwold into it. Monks lived, prayed, farmed, and wrote there for over 5 centuries, in the shadow of a 180-foot naked man with a club. Their charters don't mention him. Their records don't mention him. No 16th century source mentions him. In 1617, 2 surveyors, both named John Norden, father and son, walked the manor of Cerne and wrote it up in detail. They noted the well. They noted the earthwork ring on the summit above the figure, the one locals call the trendle. Between those 2 entries on the slope, they described nothing. Norden made a habit of flagging ancient monuments in his other surveys. The giant finally enters the written record on the 4th of November, 1694. Not in a chronicle, not in a saint's life, not in a traveler's account. In the parish account book of St. Mary's Church as a line of expenditure. For repairing the giant, 3 shillings. 700 years of silence around an object no one could possibly fail to see, broken at last by a bookkeeper logging a small bill. So the argument runs in two directions and hasn't closed. Helen Gittas and Thomas Morecombe, writing in Speculum in January 2024, read the figure as a Hercules, a warrior's image of manhood cut as a muster station for the armies of Wessex during the Viking raids, a giant signpost on a hanging spur beside the military roads, with water and an alderman's supplies close at hand. On that reading, the monks didn't carve him. They inherited him and quietly reinterpreted the club bearing stranger on their doorstep as their own Saint Eadwold. Their argument turns the nakedness inside out. Monks wouldn't have depicted their own patron naked if they'd cut him from scratch, so the figure must already have been there. Martin Papworth and the National Trust read the same evidence as a story of forgetting. The laboratory dated the lowest surviving layer, not the finished figure, and the outline was recut many times. The dates climb like a staircase, 10th century at the bottom, 13th century above it, the upper limit of one sample running as late as 1560. To Papworth, that latter reads as abandonment and revival. Carved in late Saxon Dorset, grassed over, lost, then sliced open again much later. And Ronald Hutton pushes back against the whole medieval date. Across those centuries, Britain has no documented tradition of carving chalk figures at all. Earlier there is one. Later there is one. In the middle, nothing. His second objection came out of the same trench. The snails found in that lowest deposit belonged to a species that only reached Britain in the 13th and 14th centuries, carried in accidentally with the straw and hay packed around cargo from the continent. Mike Allen, who studied them, is blunt about how they arrived, which leaves one sample of dirt saying two incompatible things at once, and one of those two readings has to be wrong. Here is an object impossible to overlook and not a line of paper for 700 years. The next story runs the other way entirely. There the paper survives in heaps, wills, notarial acts, a house still standing, a tombstone the man commissioned while he was alive. And in that entire mountain of documents there isn't a single word about the thing he became famous for. Number 5. The Alchemist invented too late. A carved slab of stone lies in a Paris museum today, barely bigger than a serving tray. At the top, a bust of Christ with Peter and Paul beside him. Sun and moon in the upper corners, ordinary church carving for a crucifixion. At the bottom, a naked corpse laid out flat, ribs showing, hands folded. The man in that carving ordered it himself, chose the design and paid for it while he was alive and healthy. The inscription names him, and then it names his trade. The late Nicolas Flamel, formerly a scrivener, not a magus, not a philosopher of fire, a clerk who wrote other people's paperwork for a fee. Underneath runs the epitaph he composed for himself: "From earth I came, and to earth I return." That is the man Europe would later crown the greatest alchemist who ever lived. Flamel was born somewhere around 1330, probably north of Paris. His job title in the records is public scrivener. He drafted contracts, letters, and settlements for people who couldn't draft them. He swore an oath to the University of Paris, and he ran a school teaching the same trade. He didn't make books. Archive work on the Paris book trade by Richard and Mary Rouse showed he had nothing to do with producing them. Before 1373, he married Paranel, a woman already twice widowed, who commissioned religious sculpture in her own name. He left an unusual amount of paper for an ordinary townsman. His will, drawn up on the 22nd of November 1416, survives in a copy made in 1421. So does Paranel's, along with deeds, rents, and endowments to a hospital for the blind, to parish churches and almshouses. Across that whole mountain of paper, the word alchemy does not appear once. He left things in stone as well. The house he finished in 1407 on the street of Montmorency still stands, the oldest dated house in Paris. Its carved frieze is no mystic cipher. It sets the rent in prayer. The tenants upstairs ode a daily Our Father and Hail Mary for the souls of the dead. shop below, shelter for the poor above. He also paid for arcades at the cemetery of the Holy Innocents, carved with allegories and 2 fighting dragons, in the same yard, where public scriveners like himself sat waiting for customers. The money has a dull explanation too. In 1397 Peronelle died and left him 5,300 livres tournois. Her sister and her brother-in-law took him to court over it, and they won. The rest came from buying houses and rent income across Paris and the villages around it during the economic collapse of the 100 Years' War, when property was cheap. Some of the buildings he owned stood empty and half-ruined. The legend says he funded 14 hospitals and 7 churches, because no honest scribe could afford such charity. The accounts say modest pensions and rents, and a widower losing a lawsuit to his in-laws. The name became a brand only after everyone who had met him was dead. Toward the end of the 15th century, some 70 years after his burial, it first turns up attached to an alchemical manuscript. In 1561, a printed collection carried the first alchemical text under his name. Then, in 1612, a Paris publisher issued the book that made him famous, the one explaining the hieroglyphic figures at the cemetery. It tells of a book of bark bought for 2 florins, 21 leaves long, of a journey into Spain, and of silver and then gold made on the 25th of April 1382. So the tidy claim that the myth was invented 2 centuries later is itself too tidy. The name was already drifting through alchemical manuscripts 100 years before that printing. 1612 didn't create the legend. It sold it. Here is the part that stays open. Nobody has established who wrote that book or why. It doesn't even carry Flamel's signature. The title page credits another man, Pierre Arnauld, Lord of La Chevalerie, as a translator from Latin. One historian read that name as an anagram hiding a French writer called Berold de Verville, and other specialists declined to accept it. No historian argues that Flamel ever practiced alchemy. Villain in 1761, then Hallu, Gagnon, and Kahn all reached the same verdict. The argument is only about the mechanism of the swap. The best guess is that his own carvings did it. The dragons and allegories stood in plain view in central Paris, their meaning forgotten by the 16th century, and people began reading them as a recipe. That guess can't be tested. The arcade was destroyed, and between 1418, the year he died, and the close of that century, not one source ties him to alchemy. The forgery was good enough to fool Isaac Newton, who copied pages of the English edition out by hand. And by the 1700s, Paris gossip had him alive somewhere in the East, applauded at the opera in the very year the book that demolished him went to press. His gravestone outlived all of it in the most humiliating way. When his parish church was demolished, a greengrocer bought the slab and spread vegetables on it for years, spinach piled over the carved corpse, until the city bought it back for a museum. So a legend was pinned on one man who left behind receipts, wills, and a signed address. Next comes the reverse of that. One misread word pinned on an entire graveyard, and out of it grew 11,000 saints. Number 4. The 11,000 Virgins. In July of 1106, Cologne was digging for its life. An army stood outside the city, the defenses were too short, and every spare hand went into a trench for a new wall. The work ran past an old church across open ground, and the shovels began striking stone. Roman stone, grave slabs packed edge to edge. It was the burial field of Colonia Agrippina, a Roman city cemetery that had taken bodies for centuries. Hundreds of graves, thousands of bones. The siege broke off after 3 or 4 weeks. The trench stayed open. Cologne had turned up something far more valuable than a wall. The church beside those graves belonged to a company of virgin martyrs, and the whole plot was promptly renamed after their leader. Ager Ursulanus, the field of Ursula. By that arithmetic, every skull lifted out of the mud was a saint. 11,000 of them, the church said. That figure had a history of its own, and it was older than the digging by nearly 200 years. Here is where the number probably came from. The oldest liturgical books list the virgins of Cologne by name, and there are exactly 11 of them. Ursula, Martha, Saula, Pinosa, Palladia. The phrase written beside them was Latin and heavily abbreviated, the way scribes shortened a familiar formula, and one of the letters left standing was M. In Latin, M begins the word for thousand and doubles as the Roman numeral for it. Undecim martyrs virgins, 11 martyr virgins, read straight off the page as undecim millia virginum. 11,000 virgins. One letter, one habit of reading, and a choir becomes an army. The number appears in hard form in the year 922, in the title of a sermon preached on the Virgin's Feast. 11,000, right there in the heading. And that same sermon is the first text to quote the inscription set up in the church in the name of a Roman senator, Climatius, who recorded that he had rebuilt the ruined Basilica of the Holy Virgins from its foundations. His stone gives no leader, no Ursula, and no number whatsoever. The claim and its refutation sit inside the same document. Names were another problem. Bones came out of the ground anonymous, and between 1155 and 1164, Archbishop Arnold II put the digging on a proper footing. 9 years of organized excavation run by a monk called Theodoric. His crews reported finding small stone tablets in the graves with the martyrs' names cut into them. In 1156, an abbot shipped 2 of those skeletons and a handful of tablets across the river to Elizabeth of Schonau, a nun who saw visions, and asked her to identify the dead. She did. She questioned the saints who appeared to her, asked who each body was, and wrote down what they told her. Her Book of Revelations survives in more than 70 manuscripts. It gave the virgins a full escort of bishops and one companion in particular, a pope named Cyriacus, who resigned the papacy to travel north with them and who appears in no list of pontiffs anywhere. The Golden Legend later smoothed that over beautifully. The cardinals were furious at his abdication, it explained, so they struck his name from the records. The forgery had supplied its own alibi. Now the honest part. The misread letter is a reconstruction proposed by later scholars, and nothing survives to prove it. No original inscription carrying that abbreviation has ever been found, and the mistake, if it happened at all, happened in copied manuscripts rather than in stone. Other scholars read the same line as a personal name, an 11th virgin called Undecimilla standing beside Ursula, later swallowed by the numeral. Nobody can settle it. The bones settle something else. The collection is a Roman civic cemetery, which means men, women, and children, with burials smeared across the 1st to the 4th centuries, and nothing that looks like a single massacre. The diggers knew. They were sorting male skeletons from female ones on site, and the male ones were exactly what the visions were asked to explain, which is how the bishops and the impossible pope entered the story at all. Elizabeth herself smelled it. She wrote that she suspected the finders of the holy bodies of having the tablets fraudulently inscribed for the sake of profit. That sentence is in her own book. She recorded the suspicion, put the question to her visions, and confirmed the tablets anyway. Centuries later, a professor from Bonn confirmed that the newest excavations in Deutz turned up no such tablets at all, and the master list of the dig, Theodoric's own codex, is lost. The relics went out by the cartload. At least 1,800 skulls were distributed among 12 parish churches inside Cologne alone, and the traffic ran on for generations. And in 1643, an imperial councillor and his wife paid for the piece that says everything. A whole chamber beside the church, its walls faced entirely in human bone, ribs and shoulder blades and thigh bones set into rosettes and scrollwork and Latin lettering, a prayer to Ursula spelled out above the altar in femurs, the vault above painted blue and scattered with gold stars of 11 points each. Men in reliquary busts stand along the same walls. The room refutes its own legend, in gilt, at eye level. Cologne had bones with no names and handed out names until every one of them was accounted for. The next story runs in the opposite direction. There the name arrives fully formed and thunderously loud, known in every county of England, written down by clerks who plainly assumed their readers knew the man. Go looking for the man himself in the records, and what comes back is a crowd of strangers wearing his name like a borrowed coat. Number 3. The outlaw nobody can find. A clerk of the English Exchequer worked with a quill, a knife and a strip of parchment stitched to the strip above it, until a whole year of the kingdom's money hung from his desk in one long roll. He wrote down everything. A fine of half a penny, the value of a dead man's cooking pot, 2 shillings for the chain that held a corpse against the wall of York so the city could see what became of outlaws, 40 shillings for the sergeants hired to hunt him down, and 28 shillings more the next year for taking off his head. The English government of the 13th century priced an execution down to the ironmongery. And in all those miles of parchment there is no greenwood archer, no band of merry men, no robbery of the rich. A bureaucracy that counted halfpennies never noticed the most famous outlaw in the world. The name is there, though. That is the odd part. The name is there and it never sits still. In July of 1225, the royal justices came to York under Robert de Lexington, and the fines and forfeitures from that session reached the Exchequer the following year. One line survives among them. The Sheriff of Yorkshire owes 32 shillings and sixpence of the chattels of Robehod, fugitive. Nothing else. No crime named, no age, no village, no face. A man ran, the crown took his belongings, and the debt was never cleared. So it went into the next roll, and the next. David Crook counted that entry through 9 consecutive pipe rolls, from 1226 to 1234, 9 years of clerks copying out a stranger's unpaid balance. 6 times they wrote him as Robehod, once as Robehod, and twice, in 1227 and 1228, the pen slipped into something warmer and called him Hobbehod. Hob was the everyday pet form of Robert, the way a neighbor would have said it aloud. The only Robin Hood medieval accounting can actually show is an outstanding line of debt, whose name the accountants couldn't agree on. Then comes the entry that changes the shape of the whole question. In 1261, a fugitive from Berkshire appears in the roll of the traveling justices as William, son of Robert Lefevre, the smith's son, caught up with a gang accused of theft and of sheltering thieves. The prior of Sandalford seized his goods without a warrant. At Easter of the next year, the same case reaches the royal memoranda roll. Same man, same seized chattels, same pardon for the overreaching prior. And the clerk writes him down as William Robehod, fugitive. He didn't mishear a surname. He replaced one. Somewhere between 2 desks of the same government, a man's father's name was swapped for a nickname, because the nickname already said everything the record needed to say. Robehod meant outlaw before Robin Hood meant hero. After that the label spreads like a brand. Alexander Robehod in Essex charged with theft. John Rabunhod in Hampshire, a killing in a tavern brawl near Fareham. Gilbert Robehod in Suffolk. Robert Robehod in Hampshire, sheep stealing. Gilbert Robinhod on a tax roll in Sussex. Different counties, different crimes, one borrowed name, and almost every man wearing it is under investigation, which leaves 2 ways to read the parchment, and scholars have been split between them for most of a century. Joseph Hunter and Leonard Owen went hunting for the man behind the name, on the assumption that the entries point back at somebody real. J.C. Holt argued the reverse. If clerks pasted Robehod onto any runaway they pleased, then finding the name in an archive proves nothing about a person at all. The discovery crook published in the English Historical Review cuts hardest against the tidy solutions. If a royal clerk was already using Robehod as shorthand in 1262, the tales were common currency by the middle of the 13th century. That is fatal to the favorite candidate. the Wakefield man said to have been swept up in the rebellion of 1322, and to the chamber porter of the same name who drew 3d. a day 2 years after that. The legend is older than its supposed original. No man inspires a story that was being told before he was born. The chroniclers are no steadier. Andrew of Winton files Robin under 1283 and calls him good. Walter Bower files him under 1266 and calls him a famous cutthroat. They can't both be right, and neither one cites a document. And here is the honest limit of all of it, said once and plainly. A record can be read in either direction. The Berkshire entries and the pipe roll debts can mean a real fugitive whose name hardened into a byword, or a byword that clerks hung on real fugitives. The parchment carries no arrow. It shows only that by the time the name appears beyond dispute, in the poem of William Langland in 1377, the rhymes of Robin Hood were the sort of thing a lazy man knew better than his prayers. Still, that is a trace. Thin, borrowed, misspelled 9 times over, but a trace, sitting in the tax accounts of a real government. The next national hero left less than that. Not a writ, not a fine, not a debt, not one document from his own century, in a country that kept its charters with care. What turned up instead was somebody else's story, set down in another language 250 years before anyone in his own country wrote his name down. Number 2. William Tell's apple shot. The apple was set on a child's head, and the child's own father was ordered to shoot it off. The order came from a bailiff who had hung his hat on a pole in the market square of Altdorf and demanded that everyone passing by bow to it. The father didn't bow, and that was the price. He drew 2 bolts. One he laid on the string. The other he pushed inside his coat against his chest and left it there. The apple split. The boy stood, and when the bailiff asked what the second bolt had been for, the archer answered to his face that it was meant for the bailiff, in case the first one had gone into the child. That answer got him arrested. By the story that follows, he broke loose on the lake, leapt from the boat onto a rock ledge between Flewlin and Sissican, waded in the sunken lane at Kusnacht, and killed the man who had made a father aim at his own son. That is the founding scene of Swiss freedom. The day attached to it is the 18th of November, 1307. The difficulty is where the scene first appears in writing, not anywhere in the 14th century. The archer's first known appearance is a manuscript compiled around 1470 by Hans Schreiber, land clerk of Obwalden. More than 160 years stand between the shot and the first sentence ever written about it, and the scene had already been written down elsewhere. Around 1200, the Danish chronicler Saxo Grammaticus set it out in the 10th book of his History of the Danes. His archer is Toko, also called Palnatoki. Toko boasts at a feast that his first arrow can take an apple off a stick. King Harold Bluetooth takes him at his word and puts the apple on the head of Toko's own son, and the boy is sent down a slope. Toko pulls out more arrows than he needs and keeps them out of sight. Asked afterwards why, he says they were for the king, had the first shaft struck the boy. The apple, the son, the hidden second arrow, the insolent answer, all of it in Denmark, roughly 2.5 centuries before a Swiss clerk touched parchment. And the Swiss text isn't a chronicle either. Schreiber's volume is an office book. 77 copied charters, privileges, treaties, and court rulings, with a short narrative running about 25 pages behind them. It was put together while the empire held a ban over Unterwalden, imposed in 1469 at Habsburg urging, and its purpose was legal. It set down why these valleys owed obedience to no foreign bailiff. The legend was born as an argument in a lawsuit. 4 years after the book was made, the Habsburgs and the Confederation made peace, and the hero of a war of liberation had arrived exactly in time for the war to be called off. So the argument splits 2 ways. Most historians read the story as a ready-made Scandinavian plot lifted whole. A minority answers that a marksman forced to aim at his own child is a wandering motif that can grow anywhere, and that some real local rebel may lie underneath it. The administration of the day carries neither man. Between 1303 and 1307, the Habsburgs had a survey drawn up across 66 districts, listing incomes, court rights, patronages, and every claim worth collecting. It doesn't note a bailiff named Gessler, an execution, or a revolt in Uri. In law, the valley sat outside such a bailiff's reach anyway. Uri had been placed directly under the emperor in 1231, Schwyz in 1240, and in 1309 all three lands were freed from any outside jurisdiction. The tyrant didn't even keep his own name. In most of the early texts he is Gryssler. It was Aegidius Tschudi, writing in the middle of the 16th century, who made Gessler standard, the name of a real family of Habsburg servants. A real Hermann Gessler did govern harshly at Groningen at the end of the 14th century, decades after the shot he supposedly ordered. Tschudi also supplied the exact day, the exact meadow, and the archer's death. Tschudi is also the man historians have caught bending documents to fit the version he preferred. The one piece of hard evidence arrived late, and arrived conveniently. A record of an assembly of 1388, in which 114 people who had personally known the archer attest to the building of a chapel at the Rock, was unheard of until 1759. It surfaced in precisely the years when the legend was first being challenged in public, and it is treated as a forgery. The earliest man to see through the whole thing would end his career in Habsburg service. Francois Guillemin printed the story in 1598, then wrote privately in 1607 that the closer he examined it, the more the whole account looked to him like pure fable. He never printed that part. When the challenge did reach print in 1760, the reply was fire. The French edition of the book that named the Danish original was burned by the public executioner on the main square of Altdorf, the square where the legend had put the hat on its pole. Decades later, a historian who had worked his way to the genuine charters was burned in effigy on a meadow above the lake. It worked. In a survey taken in 2004, 60% of the Swiss still held that the archer had been a real man. Here a country defended its legend by burning the book that touched it. In the last story, there is nothing left to touch. Every solid thing in it went missing one after another across the centuries, until the greatest discovery in medieval Britain came down to a description of an object nobody alive can examine. Number 1. Arthur's grave at Glastonbury. On the 24th of May, 1184, fire took Glastonbury Abbey. The church burned. The cloister burned. The library burned, and so did the holy relics which had been the abbey's surest draw for pilgrims. Rebuilding started at once with the Lady Chapel, paid for by Henry II, and it was consecrated in 1186. Then the money died with the man. Henry was gone by the summer of 1189, and Richard I installed his own kinsman, Henry de Sully, as abbot. 2 years later, the monks went digging in the old cemetery south of the Lady Chapel, between two ancient stone pyramids nobody could read anymore. The stated reason wasn't Arthur at all. A brother had died, and he had asked to be laid in that exact spot. 7 feet down they struck a slab too heavy to shift easily, and fixed to its underside was a small lead cross with the writing turned face down against the stone. 9 feet below that, 16 feet under the grass, lay a coffin hollowed out of a single oak trunk. Inside, by the account of Gerald of Wales, were the bones of an enormous man. Held against the tallest monk standing there, the shin bone reached 3 inches above his knee. The eye socket was as wide as a palm. The skull carried 10 wounds and more, every one healed over except a single larger break that had left a gaping hole. 2/3 of the coffin held him. The last third held a woman, and in that last third lay a lock of golden hair that had kept its color and its freshness. A monk snatched it up to show the others, and it collapsed into dust in his fingers while they watched. The chronicle offers this as a lesson on the vanity of worldly beauty. Read cold. It is the only piece of physical evidence in the story, destroyed in the same second it was produced. And the pit, as described, still had room in it for a third body. Gerald wrote the scene up around 1193 and insisted he had handled the cross himself and examined the bones at the abbot's invitation. He also names the source. Henry II had told the monks where to dig, having heard it from a Welsh bard. Gerald wrote at the Plantagenet court. His report isn't an outside look at the affair. It is part of it, which brings in the most awkward witness, and he isn't an archaeologist. Around 1125, William of Malmesbury set down that Arthur's grave was nowhere to be seen, and that this was precisely why the old songs kept spinning the tale that he was still to come. A few years after that, the same William wrote a history of Glastonbury for the monks of Glastonbury with the run of their library. He described the old church, the relics, the 2 ancient pyramids in the cemetery. About Arthur, not one word. 65 years later the grave surfaced in that same cemetery, at the precise moment it was worth the most. The worth didn't stop at pilgrims. In Easter week, on the 19th of April, 1278, Edward I and Eleanor of Castile had the tomb opened at dusk, and the bones carried to a black marble tomb at the high altar. He did it in the middle of his campaign to force Wales under English rule, and the skulls and knee joints were kept outside the tomb, on show, for popular devotion. Edward later boasted that he had taken back Arthur's crown from the Welsh. A dead king on display in an English abbey was worth far more than a living one waiting in somebody else's song. So the argument runs 2 ways. Most historians now read the whole excavation as staged, a performance to pull pilgrims and royal patrons back after the fire. There's no direct proof of it. What exists is motive, timing, and convenience, lining up perfectly, and that isn't the same as evidence. The rival reading is harder to dismiss because parts of it are demonstrably true. Coffins hollowed from oak trunks were a genuine early medieval practice. The pyramids were real late Saxon cross shafts. The monks may have opened an authentic ancient burial and simply hung the right name on it. The cross doesn't settle anything either. It survives as one engraving, printed by William Camden in 1607, and the antiquary who printed it took its crude, barbarous letter forms as proof of great age. Radford, an archaeologist who believed in a historical Arthur, later put those same letters in the 10th century. Nor does the wording hold still. Gerald alone gives Guinevere as Arthur's second wife. Ralph of Coggeshall, Leland and Camden hand down a shorter text without her. Across every version, only 3 elements repeat: the name, the word buried, and the Isle of Avalon. In 1962, Ralegh Radford dug beside the Lady Chapel and told the press he had located the pit of 1191. Decades later, Roberta Gilchrist of the University of Reading went back through Radford's own excavation archive and concluded that he may have overstated his evidence, and that his grave of Arthur was an ordinary cemetery pit, cut somewhere between the 11th and the 15th centuries. There is nothing left to test. The bones vanished with the abbey in 1539, when the last abbot was dragged through the town and hanged on the Tor. John Leland had described the black marble tomb only a few years earlier: 4 lions at the base, a crucifix at the head, Arthur carved at the feet, and not one fragment of it survives. The cross outlived the monastery by roughly 2 centuries, kept in a parish vestry, then in the private house of the Chancellor of Wales, then nothing. In 1981, a lead pattern maker from Enfield carried a lead cross into the British Museum that matched the recorded size to 1/8 of an inch, refused to say where it came from, served 9 months for contempt of court, and walked out having surrendered nothing. The museum never ruled on it. The greatest grave in Britain is a rectangle of turf with a label lying in it, and every object that could have answered the question is gone. Line the 10 of them up and the same shape shows through every time. Not quite a lie and not quite a memory either. A gap. A countess whose lands are written into a royal survey and whose ride is written nowhere for the better part of 2 centuries. A single sentence in the Irish annals that grows a rope, an anchor, and a drowning sailor over the next 500 years. A wandering man whose name changes with every country that meets him. A procession of the dead reported by a monk at the moment the church needed the dead to be somewhere. A giant cut into a hillside that no medieval clerk thought worth a line until a repair bill came in. A scribe of Paris who became the greatest alchemist in Europe only after somebody put his name on a book he never wrote. Thousands of Roman bones lifted out of the ground in one building season and given new owners. An outlaw who turns up in the rolls as a label rather than a man. A national hero first written down when the nation needed one. And a king dug up in the graveyard of an abbey 7 years after it burned. Every one of them has a real document behind it. Every one of those documents is late. That is the pattern, and the lateness is the part worth staring at because legends do not drift in out of nowhere. Somebody sat down with a pen and made a decision about what the past was going to have contained, and in nearly every case the reason was sitting right in front of him. A fire, a toll, a border, a shrine with nothing in it, which leaves the question the sources cannot close. When a story surfaces too late to be checked, is there always something real underneath it, an older telling, an actual burial, a real woman on a real horse? Or does the parchment simply supply whatever the moment is short of? Pick the one you think has something genuine at the bottom of it, and the one you are certain was manufactured, and put both of them in the comments. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe.